Did the Gospel of Luke actually get the very first detail of the Christmas story wrong? I'm not asking that to be rude, I'm asking because history is genuinely strange in this passage. And by the end of this video, I promise you, you will understand this problem that most pastors never mention or talked about, and most scholar can't ignore. Here's a verse that most people read every Christmas, and probably they don't understand it fully. In Luke chapter 2, verse 2, we read, it says that around the time of Jesus was born, the Roman Empire, Augustus, actually ordered a census, a count of whole world. And it says these census happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Sounds simple, right? But that one little sentence has caused more headaches for historians than almost anything else in the New Testament. Because when you line it up with other sources in Roman history that we have, the data that we have, the location don't fit, and the census don't fit, the dates don't fit, and it seems that something wrong here. So today, let's put on our historian hat, no anger, no agenda, just evidence. And we are going to ask a simple question here. Did Luke get this right? And if he didn't, what does that tell us? Let's get into this.
There is a kind of a dating detail between the two that is problematic, which is that Herod dies in 4 BC, around then. The Massacre of the Innocents, if it happened, and it's not mentioned by Josephus, must have happened before that. And Quirinius, the governor of Syria, who is administering this tax, it's in AD 8, I think. So there's basically a decade gap, and it seems to me very difficult to square that. There's also the additional issue that if Joseph is coming from Galilee, Galilee is not ruled by Rome. He's a subject of Herod Antipas, and therefore he's not going to be taxed by the Romans. And there is no evidence that there is a universal tax. There is no evidence that even if there was a tax, that they would have had to go to the place that their forefathers came from. And Joseph is going there because he's a descendant from David. I mean, David lived 1,000 years before. The whole thing seems highly implausible.
Okay.
And as I say, no evidence for the Massacre of the Innocents. You'd think Josephus.
Why do you think that it is there then? Do you think someone has decided we need a backstory? What's the kind of motivation?
I think that, as I say, I don't think that getting the granular documentary detail 100% accurate is the prime concern of either Matthew or Luke. Their prime concern is to demonstrate that Jesus is what Christians say he is, and occasionally their attempt to convey that leads them into thinking in terms of poetry, I think.
Okay.
And I think that there is a poetry about the angel appearing to the shepherds, or the wise men coming, or even the Massacre of the Innocents in all its horror, that is, for the writers of the Gospels, profounder. I think also specifically with Luke, I suspect he's read Josephus, because Josephus is very interested in this tax that Quirinius inspires. And Josephus associates it with a rebellion that then appears in Acts of the Apostles. So, I mean, it's odd that tax and the rebellion that happened, that's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, inspired by this tax. It suggests to me that Luke is working from Josephus, and his chronology may not be entirely accurate. On top of that, I think that particularly in Luke's gospel, there is a sense of the cult of Augustus, and that there is a degree to which the life of Jesus is a counterpoint to the life of Augustus. And that's what Augustus is, Augustus is there at the beginning. It has to be Augustus. That's why it's a global tax, because it's the global sweep of Caesar, and the birth of Jesus in poverty and obscurity is a deliberate counterpoint to the birth narratives of Augustus, which have an eerie parallel to those of Jesus. So there is a kind of proposed Massacre of the Innocents, for instance, in Suetonius's Life of Augustus. So I think there are kind of all kinds of complicated things going on there.
Quite a lot to potentially respond to there.
Yeah, and I won't try and respond to it all because I don't think time will allow, but there's so much I could say. I suppose I would start from saying, say with Luke, I'm finding it to be accurate in a granular way in Luke 15, which I've studied a lot, this story of the two sons, and various things where it really seems that almost every word has to come from Jesus because of the artistic whole and the way it patterns with other things that are across his teaching. So I'm also thinking Luke seems to say in the first 4 verses of his gospel, I've taken a lot of care over things. And he's writing for people who know about Roman tax from their own personal experience. And he's got to sound, I think, plausible to them. So I think those would be some sort of things I would frame. And I suppose when we do history, how do you put everything together? And I would say I'd want the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, to stand there along with Josephus as things that we use to try and work out what happened. Going to Matthew, there's a little detail in the end of Matthew 2, which is really interesting, which is that the Holy Family's gone down into Egypt, escaping Herod, who does have a reputation for killing quite a few people. And I'm not sure Josephus necessarily has to mention, let's say, 20 children or more, killed in Bethlehem area. I mean, he tells you generally that
that would have not necessarily made the news given his general.
Yeah, he had enough children to kill, and I'm quite busy with that. But of his own children, sorry, what I meant is that what you do get though is that an angel appears to Joseph, say you can go back now, and he goes back, and then it says then he learned that Archelaus was governor, and so he went up to Nazareth, and that's really interesting because was tetrarch, because the way Herod kept on changing his will towards the end of his life meant they all had to go off and be decided by Caesar, and everyone didn't know at the point when he died who was going to take over from Herod the Great. And so there's just that piece of historical knowledge there at the end of chapter 2, that there was that surprise knowledge that came out after Herod's death, and that to me is an interesting sort of feature to have in the narrative. Both Matthew and Luke place Jesus' birth in the time of Herod, who's normally thought to die in 4 BC. There's then this issue in Luke chapter 2, verse 2, where it says this census first took place, or this first census took place when Quirinius was governor of Caesar and governor of Syria, sorry. And the interesting thing there is it doesn't just say this census took place. It says this census first took place. And he seems that Luke's pointing to something more complicated than you'd necessarily know. So I think there are various possibilities. And once you allow Luke to stand there along with Josephus, who is absolutely our main source for what's going on with the census, then you can have a more fruitful dialogue. Josephus has a compelling account because he has the rebellion that goes on at the time when this bit of Judea.
Okay, here. So it was very long. So if you guys interested, you can watch the whole video. It's gonna be like around 2 hours. But here, what Tom Holland, which is a Roman historian, trying to say, I can summarize it. Like 2 things happen here. That from his perspective as a Roman historian, I think it's quite an important things. So first, that there is a guy by the name of Augustus who ordered a census of whole world, which according to Tom Holland, it never happened, whole world. And 2, it happened when a man named Quirinius was governor of Syria. Okay, 2 big claim. Ordered a census, the whole world to be taxed. And second, it happened when the man named Quirinius was running Syria. Now, and one more thing. In Luke chapter 1 verse 5, if we read it, it says that it actually informed us that this happened in the days of King Herod. So Luke gives us 3 anchors here, I guess. Herod the king, a worldwide census, and Quirinius the governor. The problem is simple to say, but it's very hard to solve. These 3 things, Herod, census, and Quirinius, do not happen at the same time, not even close. So, since I played this clip for you, I'm going to play another clip which is in very line with the idea or perspective of Tom Holland, and then I get back to people like N.T. Wright and some other New Testament scholars when it comes to this text.
Don't have calendars like that, and so they date things by who was ruling when. This is very common in the Roman world. You say, this happened when so-and-so was the consul, for the second time. It's how they date. And so he's dating this. He's saying this is during when the census that happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. But the problem is that Quirinius became the governor of Syria 10 years after Herod the Great had died. And Luke is also specific that this happened during the reign of Herod the Great. And so he just didn't, he didn't know. And you think, well, how could he not know? Well, okay, so 60 years ago was, I guess it was probably in the 1970s. And suppose I say something about how George Shultz was the Secretary of State when, Richard Nixon was the president. I don't think that's true. I don't know if that's true or not. See, I don't even know. And I've got a PhD, and I have newspapers and books and things. I don't think George Shultz was the Secretary of State till later. But you associate people in your head, and so he's saying this thing about Quirinius, and he's wrong. He couldn't have been. It's a contradiction with known facts. We know when Quirinius was the governor of Syria from a number of ancient sources that have no stake in the matter. Josephus just tells us when he was the governor of Syria, and it was, after Herod the Great was dead for 10 years.
So this seems to be a flat contradiction. Again, not because we've got sort of two competing sources and they say things a little bit differently, but within a singular narrative. What do Christians say about this contradiction?
Well, what they usually say is that they come up with some explanation that Quirinius was a governor again, that they invent a different rule of Quirinius, or they say, all the other sources got it wrong. Actually, Luke is right. You've got to say something, but usually they say something about how there was a local census under Quirinius, and it's referring to that one. But then they can't resolve the thing with Herod without just saying that the other sources are wrong, or that this was the second time Quirinius was governor of Syria, which is not true either.
Yeah. Now, how troubling is it, do you think, or should it be to a Christian to just be able to say something like, yeah, Luke got this wrong?
Yeah,
I mean, the Gospels, inspired by God, by the Holy Spirit, moving the pen or whatever, but the Gospels are written by men.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it perhaps shouldn't be as problematic as people claim it might be, to just say, look, I still believe in the thrust of the story, but Luke just got this bit wrong.
Yeah, I know. Well, it'd be much easier for people just to do that. And a lot of people do, of course. I mean, when I was trained at Princeton Theological Seminary, all of my friends there were training for Presbyterian ministry. And most of them would have had no trouble saying, yeah, well, that's not right. Historically, it's not right. But the point of the story...
When apologists actually trying to solve the problem, they come to these, it was the first census. They think that probably there was another one because Josephus actually tells us about 6 CE that there was another census, but not just whole world, but it was like in Judea, because Romans never did like whole world taxes. But probably this part of Luke's story has no support outside of the Bible. That's the whole point. Another one, the Quirinius wasn't governor of Syria at the time that Luke portray him as a governor here. We actually know who was running Syria during Herod's final years. But let me just get back to NT, right?
And so the question then is about a translation of Luke chapter 2, verse 2. And this hinges on a Greek word, prote, the word from which we get protological. It's a Greek word which means first or before. And as an adjective, it regularly means protos, or prote is the feminine form, means something before something else. Yeah. In John 1, John the Baptist says, this Jesus is the one who ranks, who comes after me because he was before me, and it's protos mu, before me in the genitive there. And so the normal translation of Luke 2:2 is, this was the first census when Quirinius was governor of Syria, reading that last phrase as an absolute phrase giving you a time, but that's not actually the natural meaning of the Greek. The natural meaning of the Greek is this census was before the time when Quirinius was governor of Syria. In other words, Luke knows perfectly well there was a big census under Quirinius, and the reason we know about that was there was a massive riot. Yeah. There was a revolution, and hundreds of young Judeans were crucified because they were rebelling against Rome.
Yeah, census is about taxation.
Exactly.
So they want to count the numbers so they can tax.
And taxation is also about symbolically Rome is king here and your God isn't king. I mean, so this is very sensitive stuff. But I think Luke knows perfectly well that this census was before that big one that you've all heard of, so that it's then purely a matter of translation. And yes, the Greek could be read either way, but I think it's more plausible simply in terms of the Greek structure. I've actually slightly hedged my bets in my own translation because I've got it both. I've said this was the first census before the one when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And it seems to me that's a perfectly plausible and I would argue preferable reading of the Greek. Now, from the misreading of that verse, people have built out, as your correspondent, our correspondent has, to say, well, if Luke was wrong about the census, then presumably we lose the shepherds, and presumably
census before the Quirinius become governor of Syria. That's another kind of reading that some people prefer, although most of the historians don't read it that way. But to me, as I investigate about this subject, probably the best things that I learn, and it seems to me that is correct one, is what Mark Goodacre here has to say, which I really love, and I'm going to share what he in the course that he taught, Mysteries of Synoptic Gospel, he actually go through this text. Let's see.
What's happening here? One possibility is that Luke has got the information about Quirinius from Josephus, and that Luke has misread it. Josephus mentions Quirinius in his big book, The Jewish War, which dates to the 70s, and he also mentions him in the Antiquities, which he wrote in the 90s. I think it's really likely, following Steve Mason, that Luke does know Josephus. Lots and lots of the political details that you see in Luke's gospel line up with things that you see in Josephus. Now, this is a controversial view. There are many, many scholars that think that Luke simply knows the same material that Josephus has just from oral tradition, or because he talked to people that were in the know and that kind of thing. I don't think that's the case, though, and I'll tell you why. This is Steve Mason's argument. Luke mentions the census again in Acts of the Apostles in Acts 5:37. When he mentions it there, he talks about the days of the census, and he goes on to talk about Judas and Judas the Galilean. The thing is, Judas comes several decades after Judas the Galilean, but Luke mentions him first. Josephus in Antiquities 20 also mentions Judas before talking about the sons of Judas the Galilean. So you have that same order of Judas and Judas, even though chronologically that order was reversed. So I think that probably what Luke has done is he's pulled this detail about Quirinius from Josephus. But if he has done, he's misread it. I think I know why he's misread it and how he's misread it. I think he's confused two Judases, because there was a Judas who was around in 4 BCE, and that is about the time when Herod the Great died. I think he's conflated those two Judases, and that's how he's misread Josephus. I sometimes wonder whether Luke took notes from Josephus and actually didn't read his notes as well as he might have done. But that's my best guess of what's going on there.
People don't travel for census. Now, there is another problem that I think most people miss here. In Luke's story, Joseph has to travel to Bethlehem. Why? As I said before, because his family came from King David, and David was actually from Bethlehem. But there is a thing. Roman census didn't work that way. A census counted you where you lived, where you owned land, where you paid taxes. That was the whole point of the tax. It was about money. Nobody was asked to travel to hometown of his ancestor. And remember, David lived around 1,000 years before Joseph. So this is very hard and implausible that Roman asked these people from north of Israel to go back to their ancestry for registration for taxes. So that's another one, I guess. So the census didn't even cover Galilee, which is the north part of Israel. Another thing, the census of 6 CE was for specific places that Josephus mentioned that. It was for Judea, which is for south. the southern region, right? When Roman took direct control of it, and Joseph actually lived in Nazareth, and Nazareth was in Galilee, the northern region. And Galilee was not under the direction of Roman or direct Roman control at the time. It was run by local rulers like Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. So a tax census for Judea would not apply to someone living in Galilee. Joseph wouldn't have to register at all. The census wasn't for this area. Also for Mary too, because she was a female. And so, I mean, it seems that the whole story of coming from north to south for registration, it's unlikely. And I think from this part of that we read, and there's a different view in scholarship, that scholars actually raise an eyebrow when it comes to these texts. Luke seems to know about this real census, the actual one, the one in 6 CE. How do we know? Because Luke wrote the second book of Acts, and in Acts chapter 5, verse 37, Luke actually mentions a man named Judas the Galilean. He says Judas led a revolt in those days of the census. That census, the one that made people angry enough to rebel, is around 6 CE, and Josephus talks about. Think about what's happening here. In one book, Luke knows about these census, and in another book, which is the Gospel of Luke, it seems that he confused them. So following what Mark Goodacre actually mentioned, it seems to me that this is probably what happened, that probably Luke read Josephus and, confuse what's going on here. As I promised you to be like no agenda, telling you what the defenders of the Gospel of Luke and, reliability of the Gospel of Luke, those people, what they have to say here. Answer 1, the before reading. The Greek word for first in this verse can sometimes be twisted to mean before protos. So the verse would read, this census was before Quirinius was governor of Syria. That would solve the problem. But most scholars, I would say, find this reading very forced. It's not the natural way of reading Greek. The plain reading is just the first census when Quirinius was governor. Answer 2, the two jobs idea. Some people argue that maybe Quirinius, governor of Syria, was twice. Once earlier under Herod and again in 6 CE. It's possible in theory, but there is no solid evidence for it. He had an earlier turn as a governor. The records we have point to other men in that job. So these answers exist. Some people find them very satisfying. Many historians don't. And that's an honest disagreement. You can weigh it yourself. And this is my conclusion. So where does this leaves us here? Here's a careful way of saying it. On the historical evidence, I say that we have in this discussion, Luke's census, it seems to me is very hard to defend. The dates clash. The worldwide census has no record, and the travel rules fit no Roman practice. And this matters for us because we're trying to see what happened. Or when I myself interviewed Dr. Mark Goodacre and I asked Goodacre, why not reading Luke over Josephus? And in response, he says that because when it comes to Josephus, when Josephus talks about politics, he usually gets things right. And it's very hard to say that Luke get these right and Josephus get it wrong. And it seems that actually Luke read Josephus, and based on the information that he had, he actually composed his account. But he's trying to tell a story. He wants to connect Jesus to Bethlehem, I guess, to King David, to the promise of Jewish scripture. The census may be less about Roman tax form and more about theology, about showing who Jesus is. And that's a very different question from, did it happen exactly this way? So let me hand it to you at the end. Do you think that Luke made a historical mistake? Do you think there is a solution we haven't fully cracked? Or do you think the whole point was never about date at all? Drop your answer in comments and I'll read them. If this is helpful, please subscribe, because next time we are actually digging into something quite important. Thank you and